Cyber mercenaries, cyber troops, troll combat. We find out more from Noelle Van der Waag-Cowling, the cyber program lead at the Security Institute for Governance and Leadership in Africa at Stellenbosch University. Welcome, Noelle.
Thank you very much, Chris.
What are cyber mercenaries?
It's a term for quite a broad range of actors. I think the first thing it's fair to say is, and typically when one thinks of mercenaries, we have a perception of groups of heavily armed ex-special forces troops, ex-infantrymen, deploying into some of the war-stricken parts of the world to undertake services that governments either don't want to or can't. So mercenaries, especially in the African context, have quite a negative history. Nowadays, we distinguish between mercenaries and private military companies, or PMCs, and South Africa actually has quite a rich tradition of PMCs that have operated in Africa. And if we just look at Mozambique recently, we've seen the Zimbabwean PMC DARC operating there. So that informs what we think of when we think of mercenaries, guns for hire. In the cyber world, how does this work? So typically not in the same way. The first problem is that there's almost zero visibility of who these actors are. But we talk about offensive cyber threat proliferation. And this is squarely where these actors fit in. So in many cases, in fact, these mercenaries wouldn't necessarily classify themselves as being mercenaries. You will get a consulting firm that's a little bit edgy, on the edge, and offers services to government, digital services, for example. And very often these are staffed by ex-intelligence, ex-military people. And there has been cases of, for example, firms in the United States. We see it as well we've seen some cases with Israeli firms, British firms, etc. And of course, all over the world, where highly skilled ex-cyber operatives from government, from retirement, not late-age retirement, then exit these firms, or what we call military contracting firms, normally high salaries. And these firms then go looking for work and consulting work all over the world. Now, what happens is they'll provide services to governments, intelligence services, could be both in tooling, but also training, even operating. But where the problem often comes in then is when mission creep begins. And the firm that's assisting a government, their brief gets bigger and bigger. And we've seen case studies of this, for example, Project Raven, where it moves from being consulting to actually taking part in operations. So that's one type of cyber mercenary example. Another is simply there's the shadow cyber weapons brokers or cyber surveillance brokers that also fall within this category. Very, very difficult to monitor and understand, because at the end of the day, shipping of armaments is one thing, but cyber weapons are code. And that code, obviously software code, can very easily be pushed out over a cloud to the other side of the world. So very, very difficult. Does fall under what we call the Basuma arrangement, but very difficult to police. And then, of course, you've got a whole bunch of bad actors, very often, let's call them normal cyber criminal groups, who can also then sell these services to a state that wants to do something to another state. And by doing so, it's easy to avoid attribution as a state actor because it's done through this third party. So already bad guys. So different categories here. What are ostensibly above board firms getting involved in things that they shouldn't, and then there's a lot of mission creep. We've got the cyber weapons brokers. We've got the already malign cyber actors who are happy to then also take part in military operations in a sort of support kind of role. Really anyone that you want it to be. The the world of cyber mercenaries is difficult to understand and comprehend. What I can say is that I think the danger is that they have meant that any type of cyber activity that you'd like to execute can be at your fingertips if your money is right.
So who are their clients mainly?
The clients would be the one option is states, obviously, to avoid, as I say, to operate in what we call that grey zone conflict area, to below the threshold of war, in that grey zone where everybody's very active. But it could also be anything from a terrorist group to a organized crime, virtually anyone that you can think of, who would need some type of cyber job done for them, could reach out to these mercenaries. But what typically defines a mercenary is when they're actually in service of usually a state. So so when you start looking at it in that context, if you look at the strategic area where cyber mercenary is operating, it would be either for a state or an insurgent grouping or something like that. You're looking at the strategic level of that would make them mercenaries, as opposed to your normal hacking as a service or something else. It's the title mercenary implies that they are operating at a strategic conflict intra or interstate level. In other words, having a geopolitical type of effect.
What are the most dangerous capabilities?
Really, they could do anything. So, typically for a nation state, your biggest concern has got to probably be what somebody could do to you in terms of that would impact your strategic stability as a state. And let's take the context of South Africa, perhaps easier to understand for most people. I think this would imply to critical infrastructure. How if somebody can start disrupting your critical infrastructure, that can now have severe consequences. So you can think of anything, and we normally think of critical infrastructure. Our first thought is water, electricity, maybe rail. Yes, all of those things. We already know how bad it is when those are disrupted. But think about them going down. But there's other things such as critical communications infrastructure, for example, bring down the entire communications network of the country, or the national payment system through which all money flows. So there's also quite a lot of digital critical infrastructure. And, so if you're looking at what could be the things that go really, really wrong, some countries worry about a nuclear cyber convergence. If, for example, cyber attackers get into a nuclear power station, actually able to cross that threshold and have what we call kinetic effect. So starting to have some type of effect that could actually cause nuclear damage or physical damage to the nuclear power station. So like on the top realms, those are the things that people worry about. But for the most part, if we bring it down to the level of hybrid type operations, which are very prevalent, that is where you meddle in another state on an ongoing basis. And that would include a mixture of vectors such as consistent disinformation campaigns, some cyber disruption, various cognitive types of campaigns, and potentially supporting an insurgency here or a populist movement there that you can see is going to be physically disruptive. So a whole little mix of things, but very hard to attribute to whoever's actually pushing out those campaigns. This is where we really see a lot of activity going on all over the world, is in hybrid operations within states.
Is the threat of cyber warfare being taken seriously enough internationally? Because it is so invisible that there's no physical threat.
I do think in the developed areas of the world, and what we would call the leading cyber powers, and that is the major Western powers, Russia, China, they take cyber warfare very seriously, and they point a lot of resources towards it. Um, in the developing world, much more difficult, simply because of the level of skills that are required to both wage cyber operations and defend against them, but also an under perception of threat because of an idea that we're not that digitally dependent, therefore we have a certain amount of cyber immunity. And that, unfortunately, is not true. And what we're seeing a lot of now, for example, in Africa and Latin America, is that there's a lot of low-hanging fruit now, and cyber criminals, for example, are making, going for that low-hanging fruit. When it comes to cyber warfare specifically, we also need to understand that the more networked your infrastructure and your military forces and all of those things are, and the more digitally dependent they are, the more that cyber operation is going to hurt you. But what's a really toxic mix in the African context is a mixture of some cyber operations. There's a massive one in Kenya about Thursday last week, which took down all Kenya government services, as well as the money transfers through M-Pesa. And as we know, Africa is responsible for about 70% of monetary mobile money transfers globally every single day. So mobile money transfers in Africa are actually the lifeblood of the continental economy, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. But then you mix that with a lot of disinformations to influence election outcomes and that sort of thing. So also, depending on the target of which area of the world or which population is being targeted, cyber threats get mixed up and dealt out differently. Kenya, like I say, is now taking a pummeling, and and there's a reason for that. And I think some of it is to do with Kenya's stance, for example, on what's just happened in Niger. And Kenya's been quite outspoken about some world events and whatnot. So immediately you see you attack some really negative attention from bad actors. The question is, how quickly was the Kenyan government able to respond and stand up its operations? And it actually, I think, did do that pretty well, considering it was such a widespread attack. But Kenya is one of Africa's leading cybersecurity nations. Southern Africa, I would say, is lagging.
I'm concerned about South Africa's vulnerability. How bad do you think we could be hit?
Well, if one's looking, for example, at infrastructure, infrastructure is mainly in the hands of either the private sector or parastatals, depending on whether you're talking about communications infrastructure or national critical infrastructure like oil pipelines or Eskom or whatever. And that comes down to how well each of those entities has planned. We talk there about the phenomenon of privatization of national security risk, because actually these are all national security risks, but they're actually in the hands of semi-private or private actors. I do think that if the state had a much more robust national cybersecurity center that was actually there to also provide additional assistance to these types of entities, that would be great. As you see happening, for example, in Europe, it's a big job to take on yourself as a private entity or semi-private entity. The resources that are required are immense, and in that sense, I do feel the state perhaps could do more. Would be really good to see very active national cybersecurity center, national cybersecurity program. In that sense, are we the worst in the world? No, we're not the worst in the world, not by a long shot. Are we up there the best? No, not either. I think we need to gauge ourselves against other middle powers, and some of them are struggling, and some of them are getting better. Part of the problem, I think, is we don't really have a recent national cybersecurity strategy or a national security strategy, and perhaps these things need to be better articulated and put out at that level and then implemented.
What is the worst example that you can give us of this taking place on the African continent, apart from the most recent one in Kenya?
The worst, an actual attack that's taken place? Cyber attack. Africa up to now has had mercifully very few what we call catastrophic cyber events. If we want to look at what in terms of cost and disruption, I would say Transnet 2021.
So South Africa has actually had the worst hit.
So how do you quantify what is the worst? So if we're looking at it in that sense, we look at, there were a couple of effects that flowed out of that attack. The one was the cost to the economy and to exporters. Two was a loss in business confidence against especially Mozambique's quite aggressive growth of its ports network, who will become increasingly competitive with Port of Durban. So there was a loss of business confidence. There was a loss of export, obviously downtime. That cost us, I think, a lot of fruits and veg and things that were waiting and lined up never actually made it out. They perished. So there was that problem. But there was a further problem of it highlighted the fragility of our national supply chain out of Port of Durban for essential items such as there's some tech goods, some medicines, fuel. As our fuel refineries closed down, Port of Durban actually has all the pipelines going out of it. So it's a massive strategic pain point for South Africa, if you want to call it that. So when you start looking at it in that context and the potential for a really bad event, it was there. And I think the loss of confidence or the shockwaves that the event sent, even though Transnet had actually shut down a lot of systems to contain it and all the rest of it, I think the psychological effect of the attack on businesses, etc., was quite bad. And then, of course, the timing of the attack within days of the July unrest raised a lot of questions about who potentially was the actor behind this attack. So,
can you tell us a bit more?
It had a lot going on, and from a financial point of view, I think it was possibly the most costly cyber attack in Africa.
Now, we've got an election coming up. The potential for interference is huge. What measures can be put in place right now to try and minimize the damage that could be done?
Okay, so our biggest issue here is the issue of digital power concentration, and many states face this problem, and that is that disinformation is extremely toxic, and it's very quickly spread on various platforms, whether that's an encrypted messaging channel like WhatsApp or Telegram, or whether it's a platform like X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, Facebook, WeChat, doesn't really matter. So there's a couple of entities globally that are responsible for an immense amount of information that gets spread and disseminated. And hence the name digital power concentration. So if you look at a firm like Meta that sits on top of both Instagram, Facebook, and WhatsApp, you can imagine the ability that Meta has to, or the responsibility that falls on that firm. Now, what is the biggest single problem in the African context with digital power concentration? Actually investing in these multinationals that we have no control over. We can't do too much to them in a hurry, and we're really beholden on them actually reacting quickly. If we reach out and say, look, these people instigating, for example, a really violent public event, we're hopeful that they're going to react. And as we saw in 2021 on Twitter, they didn't react. They did nothing. Okay, they took about a month to do something. So in that sense, it's very problematic. The other problem is they rely on a moderation type of approach at the back end of these platforms. Now, the moderation runs off algorithms, which would point out problematic text, messaging, words, etc. But many of these algorithms are not competent in indigenous languages in Africa. So how do African countries now rely on these platforms to adequately monitor and remediate misleading or bad or violent type of content? This is, I think, one of our biggest challenges in Africa as a whole, is these platforms operating in our context, but not algorithmically fit for context, if I can put it that way. So it's a big challenge. Obviously, the key isn't the kill switch, to shut down the internet, but we do see African governments resorting to that, that's not from a human rights point of view or constitutional point of view. That's an absolute no in the South African context to kill the internet. Also has massive implications for digitally controlled devices, the economy, etc. So it's not on. So how do we start to engage with these tech companies really effectively? Well, the EU sort of leads the way in that. They slap them with massive fines, and they're always busy updating those. But everybody is wrangling with the big social media platforms, etc., trying to get to a point where moderation is more effective and deplatforming, etc. It's a big problem. The other thing is that governments need big teams of open source intelligence practitioners and workers to actually assist in that type of thing, and actually root out really violent online abusers and that type of thing. That implies a very specific skill set, and again, a whole new team, a whole new workforce of workers of a different kind. Are we pivoting quickly enough to that workforce and understanding what we need? Well, we know digital skills in general are in short supply in South Africa, and what big problem is upskilling, and then people move or they immigrate, whatever. So we've got a whole sort of washing cycle going on there as well.
Well, South Africa is no stranger to information manipulation. Maybe briefly deal with the case of Bell Pottinger.
Yeah.
And huge fallout for the country.
So, what made Bell Pottinger so unique perhaps was and there, if you talk about cyber mercenaries, exactly what I was saying about, you'll get what is an ostensibly a respectable public firm sitting in what is supposed to be a well regulated democracy, operating in emerging democracies, and for a fee was, let's be honest, a gun for hire. And with absolutely no care for the consequences of whatever they were doing as long as the money rolled in. So now Bell Pottinger were an influence firm, right? And to a certain extent still visible. What now becomes even more worrying is when it's an invisible influence firm, And part of the problem that you have as well in the cyber world is when, for example, some type of cyber solution's been developed for a client, which may be planning to use it for very nefarious purposes, for example, the tooling chain of people they get to put that thing together is very loose, so they don't even know each other. They're just told, we need you to design this piece of a puzzle. They don't even know what the final product's going to be. So to actually even try and investigate and understand who's in the chain and who's done what and what was it for, it's all very oblique, even to the people that are working in that environment. And some guy could be sitting in a very nice log cabin somewhere, staring at a snow, living a very normal suburban lifestyle, and actually be involved in this tuning chain, and to a certain extent unaware of it. And like Bell Pottinger didn't very often ask questions. I think this is the question of potentially code designers and whatnot is, are you asking enough questions about what you're involved in? And then on the other hand, these guys are dangerous. So yeah, it's a difficult world. And as you also saw, the NSO group, there again, a so-called above board tech firm, registered, but President Ramaphosa's iPad 1 was one of their victims. So yes, the limits are very easily crossed.
Limited.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Noelle Van der Waag-Cowling, cyber warfare expert speaking to Biz News. Thank you.
Chris, thanks for having me. Been a pleasure.